What happens when an election is stolen in plain sight? In Venezuela, it's pushing a nation to its absolute breaking point. In the wake of the fraudulent July 2024 vote, Nicolas Maduro's government has unleashed a brutal wave of repression. We're witnessing a systematic campaign of political persecution, mass arrests, and enforced disappearances, all designed to crush the will of a people who dared to vote for change. This isn't just political maneuvering. Some international human rights bodies and advocates are using a chilling term to describe this: state-sponsored terror. As terrified but defiant citizens begin to push back against this brutal regime, the world is holding its breath and asking one terrifying question: is Venezuela about to descend into a full-blown violent conflict? The ingredients are all there: a desperate population, a divided opposition, and a ruthless government clinging to power at any cost. In this video, we'll analyze the factors that could ignite a devastating conflict and the catastrophic consequences it would have not just for Venezuela, but for the entire world. To understand the cliff edge on which Venezuela now stands, we have to look at the immediate spark: the presidential election of July 28, 2024. While the regime-controlled National Electoral Council declared a victory for Nicolas Maduro, the opposition's own tallies told a completely different story. Their analysis, based on precinct-level data, suggested their candidate Edmundo González Urrutia had won by a massive margin, with some claiming as much as 67% of the vote. What followed wasn't just a political crisis. It felt like a declaration of war on the Venezuelan people. The Maduro regime, stripped of any democratic legitimacy, responded with the only tool it has left: sheer force. Protests that erupted across the country were met with a brutal crackdown. Human Rights Watch received credible reports of killings of protesters, directly linking the violence to state security forces and the notorious pro-government armed groups, the colectivos. These aren't just random thugs. They've long been identified as part of the state's repressive machine, used to enforce social control, especially in poorer neighborhoods that dared to turn against the government. The scale of the crackdown has been staggering. In the aftermath of the election, thousands of people have been arbitrarily detained, with some reports citing over 2,000 arrests. The UN fact-finding mission documented a significant intensification of human rights violations, including torture and cruel and inhuman treatment. Detainees have described being subjected to beatings, electric shocks, and asphyxiation. This isn't random violence, it's a calculated strategy. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has stated that the government has consolidated an apparatus of control designed to silence and repress anyone perceived as an opponent. The regime's goal is clear: to use terror to atomize society, prevent collective action, and beat the population into submission. But how did it come to this? How does a nation sitting on the world's largest proven oil reserves, a country that was once the wealthiest in all of South America, collapse into a failed state ruled by terror? To find the answer, we have to rewind the clock and talk about the intoxicating and ultimately fatal curse of oil. For much of the 20th century, Venezuela was the poster child for oil-fueled prosperity. The discovery of massive reserves transformed the nation from a quiet agricultural country into a regional powerhouse. Petrodollars funded gleaming skyscrapers, modern highways, and generous social programs in Caracas. This era of abundance created what economists call a rentier state, a country that lives not off the productivity of its people, but off the rent it collects from exporting a single valuable natural resource. This created a deep structural flaw in Venezuela's economy. The government, flush with oil cash, became the central dispenser of wealth. Politics became a battle over who controlled the state-owned oil company, PDVSA, and its massive revenues. The rest of the economy, agriculture, manufacturing, was neglected. Why bother building a factory when you could get rich from an oil contract? Venezuela became dangerously dependent. By 2013, oil accounted for a staggering 98% of the country's exports. This dependency made Venezuela incredibly vulnerable. When oil prices were high, the party raged on. But when prices crashed in the 1980s, the dream turned into a nightmare. The government, suddenly starved of income, could no longer afford its lavish spending. The currency collapsed, inflation soared, and the social fabric began to tear. This shock, known as the Caracazo in 1989, saw deadly riots erupt in the capital as people protested austerity measures. It was a brutal awakening. The oil curse had a dark side, and the economic collapse it caused created the perfect political vacuum for a populist who promised to burn the old system to the ground. That man was Hugo Chavez. A former paratrooper who had led a failed coup attempt years earlier, Chavez tapped into the deep public fury against a political establishment seen as corrupt and out of touch. He promised a Bolivarian revolution, and in 1998 he was swept into power. Initially, Chavez benefited from a massive surge in oil prices in the 2000s. He poured billions into social programs that provided food, healthcare, and education to the poor, dramatically cutting poverty rates. But beneath the surface, he was systematically dismantling the foundations of Venezuelan democracy and its economy. He drafted a new constitution that concentrated immense power in the executive. He packed the Supreme Court with loyalists, turning the judiciary into a rubber stamp. He relentlessly attacked the independent press, creating a vast state media machine to broadcast his propaganda. His economic policies were even more catastrophic. Guided by a rigid socialist ideology, Chavez launched a wave of expropriations, seizing private farms, factories, and businesses. He put the once competent state oil company, PDVSA, under the control of political allies who lacked experience, causing production to plummet. To fund his ever-expanding social programs and paper over the cracks of a collapsing private sector, he resorted to the classic playbook of failed states. He started printing money and imposed a web of price and currency controls, which created massive distortions and shortages. For a time, high oil prices masked the scale of the destruction. But Chavez was not building a sustainable economy. He was hollowing it out, leaving behind a fragile shell utterly dependent on a single leader and a single source of income. When he died from cancer in 2013, he left his hand-picked successor, Nicolas Maduro, to inherit a ticking time bomb. The stage was set for a total collapse. When Nicolas Maduro took power, the time bomb left by Chavez finally detonated. A sharp plunge in global oil prices in 2014 exposed the utter bankruptcy of the Chavista model. The government's income evaporated, and its response was to print even more money. The result was a hyperinflationary spiral that became one of the worst in modern history. The numbers are difficult to comprehend. The currency became essentially worthless. People needed backpacks full of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. Life savings were wiped out. The economic collapse was total. GDP plummeted, and the country entered a deep depression from which it has never recovered. The human cost has been devastating. The healthcare system collapsed, and food and medicine became scarce luxuries. Hospitals became death traps, lacking everything from antibiotics to running water. This triggered one of the largest refugee crises in the world. Since 2014, roughly 8 million Venezuelans, more than a quarter of the entire population, have fled the country. Faced with growing unrest, Maduro abandoned any pretense of democracy. He systematically repressed his opponents, jailing political leaders and using security forces to crush protests. When the opposition won the 2015 parliamentary elections, Maduro used his loyalist Supreme Court to strip the National Assembly of its powers. His rule became defined by a simple, brutal formula described by rights groups: hunger, punishment, and fear as a strategy of social control. The humanitarian emergency is now dire, with the UN estimating that millions of people require urgent assistance. For the average Venezuelan, life has become a daily struggle for survival. This brings us back to the terrifying question of 2025. Could this crisis finally boil over into widespread conflict? The aftermath of the stolen election has created the most volatile situation in years. The regime's campaign of repression has pushed society to its limit. Yet the path to open conflict is not straightforward. One of the greatest obstacles to a full-scale uprising is the fractured nature of the opposition. The man who won the election, Edmundo Gonzalez, was forced to seek asylum in Spain to avoid arrest. The popular leader Maria Corina Machado, who was barred from running, remains in hiding within Venezuela. This leaves the popular democratic movement without a clear, present leader on the ground, making it difficult to coordinate a sustained challenge. Furthermore, Maduro maintains a tight grip on the instruments of power. He has the support of the top military brass, who are deeply implicated in the regime's corruption, and have everything to lose from a change in government. The security forces and the colectivos have proven their loyalty and their brutality. There are, however, some signs of cracks. Reports have emerged of dismissals within the military of officers unwilling to repress their fellow citizens, suggesting that loyalty may not be absolute. The international dimension adds another layer of extreme complexity. A full-blown conflict in Venezuela would have devastating consequences, unleashing an even greater refugee crisis that could destabilize the entire region. The United States administration is recalibrating its policy, having already reimposed some sanctions. Washington is seeking to counter the influence of Maduro's key allies, Russia, China, and Iran, who have provided economic and military lifelines that keep the regime afloat. Some analysts fear a Syrianization of the conflict, where Venezuela becomes a chessboard for great power competition. But for now, regional powers like Brazil and Colombia are watching with extreme caution, fearing a bloodbath on their borders. Venezuela in 2025 stands on a razor's edge. The nation is trapped between a ruthless, illegitimate dictatorship and the very real possibility of a descent into anarchic violence. The stolen election has extinguished many hopes for a peaceful, democratic transition, leaving a desperate population with few good options. The regime has made its choice. It will rule through terror, no matter the human cost. The coming months will determine if the Venezuelan people and the international community can find a path away from the abyss, or if the country will finally be consumed by the flames of conflict. What do you think is the most likely outcome for Venezuela? Will international pressure make a difference, or is the country destined for greater conflict? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more deep dives into the world's most critical geopolitical crises, make sure to subscribe.